Hello everyone, and welcome to the next edition of the Holland Land Office Museum's Artifact Video Series. My name is Ryan Duffy, and I'm the director of the museum. And this week we're going to talk about one of our larger pieces that we have in the museum, and one that shows a little bit more of the history of our area and of sort of some of the institutions that we take for granted today that weren't necessarily so prevalent in our county's past. Behind me we have the post office front for the Darien Center post office, and this was used officially throughout much of the 20th century, but the history of the post office goes back a lot farther than that, and that's what we're going to talk about. And though we'll be talking about one particular post office, it's a very good example of how post offices in the mail system would work throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries. It's a little different than what we know of today, but things have progressed over time. So the story began back in 1817 when a postal route was created on the old state road from Moscow, which is now Leicester, all the way to what is today Lancaster. And along that route would be Darien Center. Now this postal route would be manned by a carrier who would make about $324 a year, and this would be a once a week route where they would have to travel to 58 miles there and back in order to deliver all the mail that was around that. So they would cover over 6,000 miles in a year. So it was a hefty trip, and maybe not the most effective, but with such a sparse population in the area at the time, it was about all that could be mustered. I mentioned that Darien was along this route, but it was also a place where a post office was put that same year in 1817. This is somewhat odd because Darien was still part of Pembroke, though it got its own post office at where modern-day routes 20 and 77 actually intersect, and this would be called King's Corners, which is actually the precursor to Darien Center. And the first postmaster there, though it was called South Pembroke, it was at King's Corners, is where King's Corners gets its name, Stephen King, who was one of the very first merchants and settlers of the area. And Mr. King would actually stay in the role of postmaster until 1849. So he was the first postmaster, and he was there for over 30 years. After the town of Darien broke off from the town of Pembroke, the post office would change its name in 1832 to Darien Center. Now this is center spelled C-E-N-T-R-E. The spelling is actually somewhat important to the story. Even though Darien Center would be the main post office, it was not the only post office in the town of Darien. There were 4 other post offices that actually sprung up around Darien to serve the residents there. You had the Darien Post Office, which operated from 1832 to 1940. You had the Fargo Post Office, which operated from 1885 to 1901. You had the Lehigh Post Office from 1897 to 1906, and the Saywins, which operated from 1880 to 1904. So besides the Darien Post Office, all the other subsidiary ones didn't operate for a very long time as the system got more centralized throughout the beginning of the 20th century. Now the Darien Center Post Office did change locations depending on the postmaster, as they usually chose the location and a lot of the accoutrement that went along with the post office. So it's not sort of how we think of it today, but it was pretty much up to the discretion of the postmaster. But mainly the Darien Center Post Office was located in and around the corners of 20 and 77, as it was the central location for the town and a place where people had to pass by all the time. So it made sense to have the post office there. Now I'd like to go back to the spelling of the post office, as originally it was Darien Center, as I mentioned, spelled C-E-N-T-R-E, but it was in 1893 when they actually changed the spelling of center to the more common spelling that we know today of C-E-N-T-E-R. Now the actual post office front that is behind me here was not an original one, but had been with the Darien Center Post Office for quite a long time before it eventually made it here to the museum. It first came to the post office with the tenure of Marcellus Taylor, who started in 1910 and actually served in his position until 1924. Now, often the tradition with postmasters is that they would basically pass down their post office front to the next postmaster, who would essentially have to buy it. So one post office front could be used by many postmasters going throughout the history of the post office. So it was again, attached to the individual, not to necessarily the institution or the building. Now there would be 5 other postmasters that would use this particular front during its history before it was eventually donated here to the museum. They were John Cochran, Charles Ortner, Eth Ortner, Frank Becker, and James Ansbro, who was the last to use it, who started in 1951. He was the postmaster until 1983, and it's he who eventually donates the post office front to the museum. Now you might be wondering, how were they able to just donate the post office front as part of the post office? But it was at that time that they had gone away completely from the old system, and they had updated any post office that sort of had the antiquated box system as we see here in the post office front with just your simple slots. And they switched more to somewhat of what we see on this side with lock boxes and combinations. So the modern P.O. box that we see today is what replaced this system. But this post office front shows sort of the older system of how mail was delivered, or in some cases kept for residents, that they would have to come to the post office in order to get their mail, as not everyone would have a mailbox, and not every place had postal service on a regular basis. So oftentimes the post office was a central location where everyone could come and get their mail and parcels and packages, as well as take care of other businesses such as money orders or other financial dealings that sometimes there was no other place to go except for the post office. So we think of today as the post office as purely a place where we get and send our mail, but back in the 19th and even the early 20th century, it took on a lot of other duties. So the postmaster had to be pretty up to date on a lot of different practices than just sorting out the mail. Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of our Artifact video series, talking about a piece that we've had for quite a while, and it takes up a lot of space, but it has a very interesting backstory, and it's a very good example of institutions from our past that we think have been the same for so long, but they've changed rapidly and extensively over time. But if you've enjoyed this video, you can go back to our YouTube channel, Holland Land Office Museum, and check out all our past videos, as we've done over 50 now. But if you'd like to come and check out any of those artifacts in person, feel free to stop by the museum. We'll be happy to show them off and tell you a little bit more about them than just what's in the video.